The morning Samuel Clark went to check on his neighbors, he noticed the chimney smoke rising in a way he had never seen before. Perfectly straight, absolutely still, as if the column of smoke had frozen solid in the November air. It was November 14th, 1858, in the hills 6 miles south of what would eventually become Branson, Missouri. The previous night had been cold, but not unusually so for mid-November, the kind of clear cold that came after the first hard frosts, but before the serious winter weather arrived. Samuel had gone to bed early, as farm families did when daylight dictated work hours, and had slept through the night without waking. Now, standing in his doorway, looking across the valley at the Henderson place, he watched that column of smoke rise from their chimney with the unnatural stillness that made something in his chest tighten. Smoke moved. Even on the calmest days there was shift and drift, the slight variations that air movement created. But the Henderson, smoke rose like a drawn line, straight and motionless and wrong. Samuel was 41 years old, had lived in these hills since childhood, had learned to read weather and seasons and the small signs that marked the difference between normal and concerning. He had seen smoke on countless mornings, had learned to judge wind direction and temperature by how chimney smoke moved and dispersed. This smoke moved according to no patterns he recognized. His wife Elizabeth came to stand beside him, their youngest daughter Mary clinging to her skirts. Elizabeth looked where Samuel was looking, was quiet for a long moment, then said, "That's odd." "Yes," Samuel agreed. "Should we?" She started, then stopped, uncertain what action the oddness required. "I'll walk over," Samuel said. "Make sure everything's all right." Elizabeth nodded, though her face showed unease that Samuel felt, but could not name. The Henderson family were their nearest neighbors, Thomas and Margaret Henderson, and their 3 boys, good people who had been living in the valley for 5 years and who had become more than neighbors, had become friends in the way that isolation made necessary. Samuel dressed warmly despite the fact that the morning sun was already beginning to cut the edge off the cold. He told Elizabeth he would return within the hour, kissed Mary's head, and stepped out into the still morning. The walk to the Henderson place normally took 25 minutes along the trail that connected the 2 farms. Samuel knew every step of it: the creek crossing, the old lightning-struck pine, the clearing where deer sometimes fed in early morning. He had walked it in all seasons, in all weather, in daylight and darkness. This morning the walk felt different, not because the trail had changed, but because the stillness was so complete. No birds called, no squirrels chattered in the trees. No wind moved through the bare branches of oak and hickory that lined the path. Just silence, and stillness, and the sense that something had paused, that the world was holding its breath. As Samuel approached the Henderson cabin, he called out in the way that frontier courtesy required. No answer came. He called again, louder, announcing his presence so he would not startle anyone who might be working in the barn or the shed behind the main house. Still nothing. The cabin stood exactly as it always stood. Solid log walls, stone chimney, small windows with shutters pulled back to let in morning light. Smoke rose from the chimney in that same perfectly straight line, rising until it was too thin to see, but never dispersing the way smoke should disperse. Samuel knocked on the door, waited, knocked again. The silence that came from inside was complete, was absolute, was the kind of silence that empty buildings held, but that occupied homes did not create, even when their occupants were quiet. He tried the latch and found the door unlatched. He pushed it open. The cabin was warm, very warm. The kind of warmth that came from a fire that had been burning strongly for hours, from heat that had built up and saturated the space until everything, walls, floor, air itself, held a temperature, and the Henderson family was asleep. All 5 of them. Thomas slumped in his chair at the table, his head tilted back, his mouth slightly open. Margaret on the floor near the hearth, curled on her side as if she had lain down to rest and never risen. The 3 boys, James, Robert, and young Thomas, in their beds in the small loft, lying in positions that suggested normal sleep. But they were not sleeping. Samuel knew this immediately, knew it before he crossed the threshold, knew it in the way that the stillness in the cabin was different from the stillness of sleeping people. He stepped inside anyway, calling their names, touching Thomas's shoulder, shaking it gently at first and then more firmly. No response. Thomas was warm, very warm, as if his body had absorbed the heat from the fire that still burned in the hearth. But he did not wake, did not stir, did not show any sign of awareness that someone was touching him, speaking to him, trying to rouse him. Samuel moved to Margaret, knelt beside her, touched her face. Warm. Her chest rose and fell with breath that was so shallow it was almost imperceptible. But she was breathing. She was alive, but she would not wake. He climbed the ladder to the loft where the boys slept. All 3 of them breathing, all 3 of them warm, all 3 of them utterly unresponsive to voice or touch, or the light that streamed through the small window. Samuel stood in the warm cabin trying to understand what he was seeing. 5 people, all of them breathing, all of them showing no signs of injury or illness, all of them simply not waking despite every attempt to rouse them. The fire in the hearth burned strongly, wood nearly consumed but still producing heat and light. Everything in the cabin was in order. No overturned furniture, no signs of struggle, no indication that anything violent or sudden had occurred. He went to the hearth and looked at the fire. The wood was almost gone, burned down to coals that glowed red and hot. But the fire had clearly been burning for hours, all through the night, consuming wood without anyone waking to add more. In normal circumstances, a fire this far along would have died to embers, would have needed tending to keep burning. But this fire burned on as if it had been fed continuously, even though no one had been conscious to feed it. Samuel backed away from the hearth, from the heat that was too strong, from the fire that burned wrong, from the family that would not wake. He needed help. He needed someone else to see this, to confirm that what he was seeing was real and not some confusion or misunderstanding on his part. He left the Henderson cabin and ran, something his 41-year-old body protested, but that urgency demanded, back along the trail toward his own farm. Elizabeth was in the doorway before he reached it, her face showing alarm at his haste. "Something's wrong," he said, breathing hard. "The Hendersons won't wake up." "Won't wake up?" "They're breathing. They're alive. But they won't wake. And the fire's wrong, somehow." Elizabeth's face went pale. "I'll get the children ready. We'll come with you." "No," Samuel said. "Stay here. I'm going to get William Marsh. See if he knows what to do. Keep the girls inside." He did not wait for her response, just turned and headed east toward the Marsh farm, moving as quickly as the terrain allowed. William Marsh was older than Samuel, had been a doctor's assistant back east before coming to the territory, had knowledge of medicine and injury that others in the valley lacked. The Marsh farm was another mile beyond Samuel's own place. By the time Samuel reached it, the sun had climbed higher, and the morning had warmed enough that his heavy coat felt excessive. But the stillness remained, the complete absence of wind or movement or sound beyond what Samuel himself created. William Marsh was working in his barn when Samuel arrived. He was 62 years old, lean and weathered, with eyes that assessed carefully before reacting. He listened to Samuel's explanation without interrupting, his face growing more serious with each detail. "Show me," he said when Samuel finished. They walked back to the Henderson place together, William asking questions about what Samuel had observed, how the family was positioned, whether they showed signs of distress, how long the fire appeared to have been burning. Samuel answered as accurately as he could, describing the warmth, the shallow breathing, the complete lack of response to attempts at waking them. When they reached the Henderson cabin, William entered carefully, moving with the deliberate assessment of someone trained to look for causes and connections. He examined each member of the family, checking for fever, for injury, for any physical sign that would explain their state. "No marks," he said after examining Thomas. "No swelling, no discoloration. Body temperature is elevated, but not dangerously so." He checked Margaret, then climbed to the loft to examine the boys. When he came back down, his face was troubled in a way that made Samuel's unease deepen. "They're all the same," William said. "Breathing, hearts beating, bodies warm but not feverish. But they're not responding to any stimulation. It's as if they're—" He paused, searching for words. "As if they're somewhere else. Present, physically but absent in every other way." "What could cause this?" Samuel asked. William shook his head. "Nothing I know of. Not illness. This isn't how illness presents. Not injury. There are no wounds. Not poisoning." He stopped, looked at the hearth, walked over to examine it more closely. He knelt near the fire, studying the coals, the way the heat rose, the configuration of the wood that had burned. After a long moment, he said, "This fire has been burning all night." "Yes," Samuel said. "That's what I thought. But look at the wood. There's not enough ash for a fire that's burned for 8 or 9 hours. This much wood would create more residue, more buildup. It's as if the fire has been consuming differently, burning more completely." Samuel looked where William indicated. He was right. The amount of ash in the hearth was far less than a night's worth of burning should have created. The fire had consumed the wood more thoroughly than fire normally did, had burned, hotter or longer, or in some way that was not normal. "Could the fire have made them sick?" Samuel asked. "Bad air from the chimney or smoke inhalation would show different symptoms," William said. "Coughing, difficulty breathing, soot around the nose and mouth. These people are breathing normally, or as normally as unconscious people breathe. This is something else." They stood in the warm cabin, looking at the sleeping family, and Samuel felt a fear that was different from any fear he had known before. This was not fear of weather, or animals, or the practical dangers that frontier life created. This was fear of wrongness, of the world operating according to principles that should not exist, of reality becoming something other than what experience taught it should be. "We should move them," William said. "Get them out of this cabin, away from that fire. Bring them somewhere else and see if they wake." Samuel nodded. This was action. This was purpose. This was something they could do even if they did not know whether it would help. Together they carried Thomas Henderson out of the cabin first, his body limp and heavy, his breathing continuing in that shallow rhythm that suggested life, but not consciousness. They laid him on the ground outside, in the shade of the oak that stood near the cabin's eastern wall. Then they went back for Margaret, carrying her out and placing her beside her husband. The boys they brought down from the loft one at a time, arranging all 5 members of the family on the ground in the cold November air. And still, they did not wake. Samuel watched them lying there, their chests rising and falling, their faces peaceful in the way that sleeping faces were peaceful, and he felt the wrongness settle deeper into his bones. People woke when moved. People woke when taken from warm places into cold. People woke when spoken to, shaken, exposed to discomfort or disturbance. But the Hendersons did not wake. "I need to check on the others," William said quietly. "If this is affecting the Hendersons, it might be affecting other families." Samuel felt his stomach tighten. He had been so focused on the Hendersons that he had not thought about the broader implications, had not considered that whatever had caused this might not be limited to one cabin, one family, one fire. "I'll stay here," Samuel said. "Keep watch. You check on the Prices and the Caldwells." William nodded and set off at a pace that was quick without being panicked. Samuel watched him disappear into the forest, then turned his attention back to the Henderson family lying unconscious on the cold ground. He waited. Minutes passed, then an hour. The Henderson family continued breathing, continued their shallow sleep, continued their absolute failure to respond to cold or discomfort, or Samuel's repeated attempts to wake them. The sun climbed toward noon. The day warmed, slightly, though November warmth was relative, and the cold ground would be uncomfortable for anyone lying on it for extended time. But the Hendersons showed no sign of discomfort, no shivering, no movement except the minimal rise and fall of breathing. William returned mid-afternoon, his face grim. "The Prices are the same," he said without preamble. "Robert and Catherine and their 2 daughters. All asleep, won't wake, fire burned all night. The Caldwells, too. John and Sarah and their son. Same thing. Fire still burning, family unconscious." Samuel felt the world tilt slightly. 3 families. 15 people total. All of them asleep in a way that was not sleep. All of them with fires that had burned through the night. All of them in cabins that were warm and undisturbed and wrong. "What about your family?" Samuel asked. "I sent my boy running. He should be checking on them now." William's voice was steady, but Samuel could hear the fear underneath it. They stood together in silence, watching the Henderson family breathe, waiting for William's son to return with news that would either confirm the pattern or provide relief. The boy came back an hour later, running hard, his face flushed with exertion and distress. "Ma and Sarah are fine," he gasped out. "They're awake. They're worried about you. But they're awake." William's shoulders sagged with relief. Samuel felt his own tension ease slightly. Not everyone was affected then. Not every family had fallen into this strange sleep. "Go back and tell them we're all right," William told his son. "Tell them to stay inside. Keep the fire low. Don't—" He paused, uncertain what precaution to recommend when the cause was unknown. "Just tell them to be careful." The boy nodded and set off again. William turned to Samuel. "We need to check on your family." They walked quickly back to Samuel's farm, both of them tense with the fear of what they might find. But Elizabeth met them at the door, her face showing relief at Samuel's return, and the children were visible behind her, all of them awake and normal and blessedly conscious. "Thank God," Samuel said, and meant it more sincerely than he had meant anything in years. They told Elizabeth what they had found. She listened with growing horror, her hand going to her mouth when they described the Henderson children lying in their beds, breathing but not waking. "What could do this?" she asked. "We don't know," William said. "But we need to check on everyone else in the valley." See how many families are affected. Over the next several hours, as afternoon faded toward evening, they visited every cabin in the valley. They found pattern and exception in equal measure. The Henderson family, asleep, would not wake. The Price family, asleep, would not wake. The Caldwell family, asleep, would not wake. The Morgan family, awake and frightened but unharmed. The Turner family, asleep, would not wake. The Reed family, awake, confused about the commotion. The Foster family, asleep, would not wake. 5 families out of 8 affected. 23 people total lying unconscious while their fires burned and their cabins stayed warm, and nothing anyone did could rouse them. The families that were awake gathered at the Morgan place as evening came, needing the comfort of community, needing to share fear that felt too large to carry alone. Samuel and Elizabeth brought their children. William brought his wife and daughter. James Morgan, who owned the farm where they gathered, looked at the assembled neighbors with eyes that showed the same confusion and fear they all felt. "Has anyone sent for the doctor from town?" someone asked. "Town's 20 miles, William said, "through terrain that's difficult even in good weather. It would take a day to get there, a day back, and we don't know if a doctor would have any more answers than I do." "But we have to do something," Catherine Reed said. "We can't just let them lie there." "We've tried everything," William said quietly. "We've moved them, exposed them to cold, shouted at them, shaken them. They won't wake. Whatever has them, it's beyond anything I understand." The room fell silent. Through the window, Samuel could see darkness falling, could see the distant glow that marked where fires burned in the cabins of the sleeping families. Those fires had been burning all day, he realized, should have consumed their fuel and died to ash. But they continued, visible as orange glows in windows that should have been dark. "The fires," Samuel said. "Has anyone checked the fires? Are they still burning?" William looked at him sharply. "They can't be. We've been gone for hours. The wood should be consumed." But even as he said it, they could all see the glows in the distance, could all see the evidence that the fires were indeed still burning, despite time and despite consumption that should have exhausted their fuel. "We should check," James Morgan said, "before full dark. See what's happening." 4 of them went, Samuel, William, James, and Robert Price, whose own family lay sleeping in a cabin half a mile away. They moved quickly through the dusk, arriving at the Henderson place just as the last light was fading from the sky. The fire still burned in the hearth. Not embers, not coals, but actual flame, consuming wood that should not still be there, producing heat that should have peaked hours ago. The cabin was sweltering, the air almost too hot to breathe comfortably, and the Henderson family still lay outside, where Samuel and William had placed them in the morning, still breathing, still unconscious, still showing no response to the cold that had settled with darkness. "This isn't natural," Robert Price said, his voice shaking. "This is something else, something wrong." None of them argued. They could all see it, could all feel it. The wrongness that had settled over the valley, that had taken 23 people and left them breathing but not waking, that had made fires burn in ways that violated basic principles of fuel and consumption. They checked the other affected cabins, found the same thing at each one. Fires still burning, producing heat and light from wood that should have been exhausted, creating warmth that should have faded, but that remained constant and wrong. "We need to put them out," James said. "The fires. We need to extinguish them." "What if that's what's keeping them alive?" William asked. "What if the fire goes out and they stop breathing?" They stood in the darkness, looking at each other, each of them understanding the terrible logic of the question. They did not know what the fires were doing, did not know if they were cause or symptom or something else entirely. Extinguishing them might break whatever held the sleepers, or it might kill them. "We have to try something," Robert said. "We can't just leave them like this." After long debate, they decided to test the theory on one fire first. If the sleepers woke when the fire died, they would know what to do. If they did not wake, well, at least they would have tried. They chose the foster cabin because it was closest, and because the Foster family was small, just Martin Foster and his wife Anne, and their infant daughter. 3 people rather than 5, 3 lives to risk rather than more. Samuel approached the fire with a bucket of water drawn from the well. The flames were strong, hotter than any fire he had tended in his own home, bright enough to cast dancing shadows on the walls. He hesitated, the bucket heavy in his hands, the weight of decision pressing down on him. "Do it," William said quietly. Samuel threw the water on the fire. The flames hissed, sputtered, died to steam and smoke. The sudden darkness was absolute, the warmth that had filled the cabin beginning to dissipate immediately. They waited, listened, heard the shallow breathing of the Foster family continue unchanged. "They're still asleep," Robert said. They waited longer, hoping that perhaps waking took time, that the breaking of whatever connection the fire created would not be instantaneous. Minutes passed. The breathing continued. No other movement, no signs of consciousness, no indication that extinguishing the fire had changed anything except the temperature. "Maybe we should relight it," James said, uncertainty thick in his voice. But even as he spoke, they heard something from outside. A sound that should not be possible. Footsteps, rapid and unsteady, the sound of someone running. They rushed to the door. In the darkness beyond, illuminated by the lantern William carried, they saw Anne Foster. She was awake, standing in the yard, her nightdress muddy from where she had fallen, her face showing confusion and terror. "Martin?" she called out, her voice hoarse as if from disuse. "Where's Martin? Where's Emma?" She looked at the men emerging from her cabin, seemed to see them but not recognize them, seemed to be waking from something that had left her disoriented and frightened. "You're all right," William said, approaching her carefully. "You've been asleep. Your husband and daughter are inside." "Asleep?" Anne's face showed confusion. "But we were just—" She stopped, her expression changing to something that might have been memory, or might have been fear of memory. "The fire. There was something wrong with the fire." "What was wrong with it?" Samuel asked. Anne looked at him, her eyes not quite focusing. "It wouldn't stop. I tried to bank it for the night, but it wouldn't stop burning. Martin said to let it be, said it was probably just dry wood catching well. And then," she paused, her face going pale, "and then I felt so tired, like I'd been awake for days, and the room was so warm, and I lay down just for a moment, just to rest my eyes, and—" "That was last night," William said gently. "You've been unconscious since then." Anne's legs gave out. Samuel caught her before she could fall, helped her sit on the cold ground. "Martin," she said again, more urgently now. "Emma, they're still sleeping," William said, "but you woke up. That means they can wake up too." But Martin Foster did not wake. His daughter did not wake. They lay in their beds, breathing shallowly, while Anne sat beside them, crying and calling their names and begging them to open their eyes. The men stood in the dark cabin, now cold without the fire, and tried to understand the pattern. The fire had gone out. Anne had woken. but Martin and Emma remained in whatever state held them. "Why did she wake and they didn't?" Robert asked. "Maybe she was closest to waking already," William said. "Maybe the fire going out was enough to break through for her." "Or maybe," Samuel said slowly, "she was different somehow. Maybe whatever took them didn't take her completely." They had no answers, only observations and guesses and the knowledge that one person had woken while 22 others remained asleep. Over the next hour, they extinguished the fires in the other affected cabins: the Henderson place, the Price home, the Caldwell cabin, the Turner house. At each one they hoped to see what they had seen at the Fosters, hoped to see someone wake and stumble out, confused but conscious. But no one else woke. 22 people remained asleep as the cabins grew cold and the darkness became complete, and the valley settled into a night that felt longer and darker than any night should feel. The conscious families gathered again at the Morgan place, bringing Ann Foster with them, sitting together in lamplight that felt fragile against the darkness pressing in from outside. Ann told them what she remembered: the fire that would not stop burning, the overwhelming tiredness that had come over her, the sensation of falling into sleep that was deeper than sleep should be. "It felt like drowning," she said, her voice quiet and strained. "Like something was pulling me down into darkness. And I could hear Martin calling me, but his voice was getting farther away, and I couldn't reach him no matter how hard I tried." "But you came back," Elizabeth said. "You woke up." "I don't know why," Anne said. "I don't know what made me different." They talked through the night, none of them able to sleep, all of them afraid of what sleep might mean now that they had seen what it could become. They discussed sending for help, for doctors, for anyone who might have knowledge that could explain or fix what was happening. But morning came before they could act on any plan, morning that brought gray light through windows and revealed the valley unchanged, cabins standing quiet, smoke no longer rising from chimneys, 22 people still locked in sleep that would not end. Samuel walked to the Henderson place in early light, needing to see them, needing to confirm that they still breathed. He found them as he had left them, lying on the ground where he and William had placed them, their faces peaceful, their chests rising and falling with that same shallow breath. He knelt beside Thomas Henderson, his neighbor and friend, and spoke to him quietly, told him that help was coming, that they would figure this out, that he needed to wake up and come back to the world that needed him. But Thomas did not wake, did not stir, did not show any sign that he heard or understood, or was even present in the body that continued its automatic functions without consciousness to guide them. Samuel stayed with the Henderson family through the morning, watching over them, keeping watch as if his presence could protect them from whatever had taken them. Other conscious families came throughout the day, keeping vigil over their sleeping neighbors, bringing blankets to protect them from the cold, bringing hope that today would be the day that whatever held them would break. But the day passed without change, and the next day, and the day after that. The conscious families took turns watching over the sleepers, moving them into one cabin where they could all be cared for together, keeping them warm and protected and alive even though they would not wake. William tried every treatment he knew: cold compresses, strong-smelling substances held under noses, loud noises, everything that should have roused someone from unconsciousness. Nothing worked. A rider was sent to town to fetch a doctor. The doctor came, examined the sleeping people, confessed he had never seen anything like it, tried his own treatments, achieved no results. Days became a week. The week became 2 weeks. 22 people continued breathing, continued their mysterious sleep, continued to exist in a state that was neither death nor life, but something suspended between. Ann Foster stayed with them constantly, sitting beside her, husband and daughter, talking to them, touching them, begging them to wake. But Martin and Emma Foster slept on, as did all the others. The conscious families began to discuss what would happen if the sleepers never woke. How long could they maintain them? How long before bodies that did not move, did not eat, began to fail despite breathing that continued? William had no answers. The medical knowledge he possessed had no framework for this, no treatment for sleep that was not sleep, no solution for consciousness that had gone somewhere human knowledge could not follow. On the 15th day, Robert Price died, not dramatically, not with struggle or pain. He simply stopped breathing in the night, his shallow respirations fading to stillness, his body releasing whatever had held it between life and death. His wife, Catherine, who had been awake from the beginning, who had sat beside him for 15 days, felt his hand grow cold and knew he was gone. The others followed over the next week. One by one, the sleepers stopped breathing, their bodies finally surrendering to the impossibility of their state. Martin Foster, Thomas Henderson, Margaret Henderson and their 3 boys, John Caldwell and his wife, the Turner family, the Price daughters, 22 people who had fallen asleep on the night of November 13th, 1858, and who had never woken, died in their sleep over a period of 3 weeks, leaving behind families who had watched and hoped and failed to understand what had taken them, or why. Ann Foster was the only one who had woken, the only one who had come back from wherever the fire had sent them. She survived, but she was never the same, would wake in the night screaming about fire that burned too hot, about sleep that pulled like drowning, about voices calling from darkness that she could not reach. The valley was never the same either. The cabins where the fires had burned were torn down, the families who remained unable to live in spaces where wrongness had occurred. The land was eventually sold, eventually used by others who did not know the history. But stories remained. Stories about fires that burned all night, consuming fuel that should have been exhausted. Stories about sleep that became something else, something that took consciousness and would not return it. Stories about the night when warmth became wrong and 22 people closed their eyes and never opened them again. The valley is still there. Families still live in those hills. Fires still burn in hearths on cold November nights. But those who know the history are careful about their fires. They do not let them burn too hot. They do not fall asleep in rooms that are too warm. They remember that fire is useful, but that fire can be wrong, that warmth can become prison, that sleep is not always safe. And on November nights, when the air is cold and the sky is clear and the conditions match what happened in 1858, some people report that their fires burn strangely, hotter than fuel should allow, longer than consumption should permit, creating warmth that feels oppressive rather than comforting. Most dismiss these reports. Most say it is imagination, suggestion, the natural variation in how wood burns and heat accumulates. But a few, those who have felt wrongness in the warmth of their own homes, those who have fought against sleep that pulled too strongly on cold nights, understand that sometimes fire does not just burn. Sometimes it takes. Sometimes it reaches into consciousness and pulls it somewhere dark, somewhere that breathing continues but waking does not. And they are careful with their fires. They bank them early. They sleep in cool rooms. They remember what happened to 22 people who kept their fires burning through one November night and who paid for that warmth with sleep from which only one person ever woke. The fires are still there, in those hills. Burning in hearths, consuming wood, producing warmth that families need to survive winter cold. But fire is not always just fire, and sleep is not always just sleep. And warmth can become the thing that takes, rather than protects. The valley remembers.